So I'm going to do a formal introduction. So first and foremost, Curtis Walker, thank you so very much for your time and attention and for setting this up since this is your Zoom. Um,
You're very
but
welcome.
yeah, but sincerely, thank you for this and for being able and willing to share your experience and your process. So at the time of this recording, well, by the time people see this recording, they'll probably be seeing your work right now at the atelier, and it should be available on the virtual exhibit as well. So, but with all that, I'm going to try to channel some questions people may have. But I think the first thing to start off with is what inspires you as an artist and what
I-
inspired you in that vein to do the work here that's on display?
My work actually starts many years before I actually took my first shoots. It starts when I'm in my, let's see, I would have been in my early 30s, and I was going through a second period of my life where I was anorexic and depressed. I would say definitely having suicidal idealization, the whole nine yards. And I went online and could not find any images of fat cis men, let alone trans men or non-binary people that represented me, that weren't either porn or like muscle bear-ish stuff was starting to happen a little bit. And I had seen images of women in the past. One of the books that inspired me was Women on Large by Toby Edison. And see, I've already forgotten the second name. Uh, the they had done these fat nudes that I had found when I was in college during another rough period of women that were supersized, and some of the people actually have transitioned over the years, which is interesting, but we didn't know that at the time. And I was really frustrated that there wasn't artistic work out there that represented my body and people like me. And I ended up like making this whole photo of what I could find and finding it really depressing. Like there was lots of before and after photos of people that had lost weight, and there was lots of anonymous photos where people's heads were cut off and they looked really ugly and really unhappy. And so I wanted to start visioning an art project. And I was at the time an artist in terms of painting and drawing, but I wasn't able to get what I wanted out of that process. So I started visioning this. And then years later, I met a bear photographer that was excited about what I wanted to do and wanted to mentor me. And before I could get to the UK where he was, I found a mattress on the side of the road and a friend that was willing to do a shoot. And I tried my first shoot. And then I found another mentor in Seattle that was willing to let me shoot in his studio with, he was like, find as many artists as you can. It was up in Seattle and I was living in Portland, Oregon. And so I was asking strangers, partially off of hookup apps, if they would show up and model for me in somebody's studio. And that was the beginning, as I got ready to travel and meet this mentor and work with him. And but it was easily 7 years after I first started thinking about it. And I started with men and non-binary people because I thought that that was my niche and that women might not be comfortable with my doing photography with them because I was perceived as a man, even though I identify as non-binary. And I was wrong. There was lots of women that were queer that approached me when I put out a call saying, hey, I'm building my portfolio. I'll take anyone that wants to, but this is the theme. I actually had cis and trans women express interest then. And so even from the beginning, I started to be like, okay, this might be two projects. This might be a men and non-binary project because I still really felt that there was a space for that, but that there was also queer people that weren't feeling represented even in the work that was in existence at the time. So that's how they became two projects, and now it's three. The third is focusing in on people partially in response to those anonymous photographs I'd seen all those years ago. I wanted images that were close in on the body that was us happy. And I wanted to see how much I could express that we're comfortable with our bodies without the face. That was part of the experiment. And so all three of those have kind of snowballed into what you see now.
What was the relationship between you and the models?
Yeah.
How much autonomy was shared between the two of you in the creation of these photographs that we see here?
My goal when I started was to get as close as you can of people being completely themselves. Now, as one of my mentors says, there's no such thing. Like, there literally is no such thing. Once you put a camera in front of somebody, you've changed who they are. But the idea was to help them be as comfortable, as natural, as much expressing what they wanted to express as possible. So I don't pose my models. If I see something I like, I might ask them to hold a position, um, or I might talk to them about what I liked, and we might try and recreate it if a shot doesn't come out perfectly. But I never pick a position for them without it being something that's coming out of them. Um, and I didn't have any relationship with a lot of the models. My first photo shoot is a friend. The second photo shoot, I took two, it was actually before the Seattle thing. I took two strangers to a nude beach and we did a photo shoot there. So often they're actually people that I don't know at first, and they become my friends sometimes through the work. Um, and I didn't know how that would go. I didn't know what it would be like to say to a stranger, "Hey, I want to capture you being as comfortable as possible in your body." Um, and I think there's a way in which them feeling a little bit anonymous sometimes helps. It can even be harder to shoot people now that I know, in a way, because there's more expectation and tension sometimes. Just depends on the person and the personality. And in fact, I find performers to be some of the hardest people to shoot because they're used to performing, they're not used to being themselves. So they try and put on different masks. It can be fun, but it's not, I have to like kind of get them to scale back. Um, but I want it to be as much in their control as possible. They choose where, they choose what they're wearing, they choose if they're with somebody. So it is as much as possible a very mutual agreement. And with the end result, I give people copies as I put it out in the world. I don't show people, like, I know a lot of artists that provide all the raw shoot, and I don't. I mainly because I'm still an amateur, partially because there's so much in there that's like just I don't want to share with anyone, but then also because it's such an arduous process to get to the final product that I wait until I'm most of the way there, and then I show them and get approval. Um, and and usually it's just, here's this photo that's going out in the world and there's a nod and we move on. Like it's not hard because I've already been so much a part of the process. But I do check in with people as the photos go on a website or like in an article or in a show.
Can you share a little bit more about the advocacy, right? Or even if
Yeah.
you want to talk about the change that we had to do.
Yeah,
Um,
sure. Yeah, this my my thinking about my work and my concepts of inclusion and teaching go back way before this project to when I was in high school and college and painting, and my father, who was also an artist, would call my work didactic. And when you look at the word didactic, it actually means to teach. And and the fact that he would use this as an insult, I think actually has a lot of sexism, lot of white supremacy, etc., baked into it. This idea that art shouldn't teach; it should just be this objective representation done by experts, and it's supposed to be like landscapes and models that are like perfect, right? And so over the years, I've come to appreciate that my work is about teaching. Then I ran a theater company that was for disabled people specifically, and I'm disabled myself. And so I think a lot of what I knew about how to ask common people to do something artistic with me, because most of my dancers and actors in my theater company were not performers by some of them were, but I'd say like 80% weren't. And so this was a similar thing where I was approaching common everyday people that wouldn't have been seen in art otherwise to come be in art. And for me, when I had been that oppressed kid, that young 30 something, late 20 something, whatever it was, I really was desperate to see myself in the work. So from the very beginning, I'm thinking I want anyone that comes to look at my work to find themselves in my work. Anyone in the queer community. It was specific to the queer community because that's who I was seeing not represented well. And so And that was my people. And so I wanted to make sure that Black and brown people could see themselves. I wanted to be sure that disabled people could see themselves. I wanted to be sure that super chubs, people around 400 and 500 pounds and bigger, could see themselves. It was inherent to what I wanted to create. It wasn't a tokenizing or a question. It was more like, how do I do this right? Rather than, should I do this at all? It was never a question of whether I should be inclusive. It was always a question of how. And so my very first approaches to people was, I want to show the people that are on the edges of our communities, that are not included. And that appealed to people pretty quickly. And I think it was through my other work, through the theater work, and through my personal commitment to my communities, that comes. Like, I have close relationships with all of the diversity that you see in my work. I have close relationships with my family members that are Black and brown, that are my chosen family members, that I children I helped raise. I have disabled people in my life because I'm disabled. I have super chubs in my life because I'm bordering on super chub myself. And so, like, it's not separate from my life. It's a part of my life. And
Um,
I don't know if I answered the original question. I think I might.
you no, you did, because the question was just, can you expand more? Like advocating is an evolving process.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, and even if you're close to a community, if you're right, even if you're close to a community, if it's not your personal experience and you didn't live that life, you're gonna fuck up. Doesn't matter how much you love the community you're adjacent to, you're gonna fuck up, and you're gonna hurt the people you love. And I had already hurt the people I love, and I had already, like, invested in that work. I think that's obvious in the work itself, is that I had to already be ready to make mistakes, and I had to be ready to be present with my own imperfect white experience, that I have learned white supremacy, and I will accidentally do make white supremacist mistakes. It's tough, but it's actually, once you start, it's learning how to be more natural again. It's not actually, learning how to be present with mistakes is part of the work itself, and learning how to not to be defensive is part of the work itself. So when a model contacted me and said, so I had named one of the photos after models' tattoos, and they had told me the story of the tattoos, and they'd been really proud of them, and they wanted pictures that included the tattoo. And the tattoo is baguette. They said it's pronounced like baguette. They came up with the word, and they got them tattooed on each other, matching as a couple. And I thought, because they were really proud of the story, that was something I probably didn't need to run by them. And I was wrong. Their concern was, once they were in the photos were in a different city, not Philly, not New Jersey, not New York. These people are out of New York but have ties to Philly. And they were concerned that white and straight people might think it's okay to use that word. And so they asked me to change the title. And I said, we can take down the image if you want to. And they said, no, we're still happy with the image. We just need a different title. So we've shifted it to untitled for now, so that we can have a longer conversation when we have the time and energy to figure out what's right for them.
Yeah,
And
there
that
was something.
conversation was resolved in one day. And that's part of what I
Yeah.
want white people to think about, is that, like, if we get defensive, it can take months. Whereas if my first response is, oh shit, I go on the website, I change it to untitled as we're having the conversation, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's like, in my sense, it's like, oh shit, all right, I've just fucked up. What do I need to do to correct it? It can happen a lot faster if I'm not afraid of fucking up.
Mm.
And so, like, I said, like, and even in the ask, the model was saying, we love your shoot, we love what you're doing for us, can you change this name? So there was already love and respect on both sides. All I had to say is, I messed up, I'm sorry, what do we need to do, right? Like,
Right.
and it becomes easier if you understand that messing up is part of the process.
I really appreciate that. And so I want to sit with that. I want to digest that a little bit. And so of the pieces, which ones are your favorites?
When I read this question, I was like, how do I decide? Honestly, I think that it's more the impact that the photos have on the models' lives themselves and or the viewers that makes them my favorites at certain points. I mean, sometimes when I'm going through the raw footage, I can be like, oh my God, this is it. Or even during the shoot, sometimes I could be like, this is it. But it's not until I hear the response from either the model or the world that I really decide which ones mean the most. Um, One of my favorites is Greg, who's a super chub sitting outside kicking his legs, looking like he's a young child. Like he's got such a big grin on his face, and he's not used to being in an environment where he's loved, and he's not used to being on a bench where he can kick his feet and where he's physically comfortable. And so being able to see him as an individual comfortable, and this was my second shoot with him. My first shoot with him is actually an adorable story too. I was shooting his husband, actually. I was doing a photo shoot with his husband. And his husband and I were pretty much wrapping up, and I was telling his husband, whose name is Josh, I was saying, you know, this is why I'm doing this work, and talking about how I wanted to see everybody represented and why I felt like racial justice as well as supersized was important. And Greg suddenly starts getting undressed while we're talking. And I looked over at him and I said, what's going on? And he said, I want to be in this. I've never seen anybody as big as me or as dark as me in work like yours. And I nearly cried in that moment. Like it was like about my third or fourth shoot ever. And somebody heard me say, I want people to see themselves in the work. And he said, I want to be in it. And that to me was like, okay, I can almost stop my work now because I've succeeded, right? Like that was a big turning point for me. And so to see him a few years later and the shoot even be more comfortable for him because we were in a mutual friend's backyard, which happened to be a model from the same shoot, by the way. They never met. But I go back up to Seattle, we do a shoot in somebody's backyard. And so like now it's a bunch of gay people in the backyard having fun being naked. And to see him even more comfortable in front of the camera, you know, those many years later was amazing. So that's one of my favorites.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. But that also reminds me. So, one question that I did want to ask, and I think you touched on it a little bit, why nudity? I
Sure.
want to say you spoke on it, but what's the influence of that
Yeah.
motif in all your models?
To some degree, I have to go back to my influences. And I actually, oh gosh, I have to, Debbie Dobkin, that's the other name. So the book I may have mentioned earlier is called Women on Large, and I saw it when it first came out in '94. No, it was created in that period, but I didn't see it for a couple of years later. I saw it in '97, '98. And I was going through a lot of issues around fat phobia, and I was dating a girlfriend who was anorexic. And to see supersized women nude in nature, a lot of the shoots were in people's homes or in nature. And I was just blown away. It made me feel like if I get fatter, I'll be okay. And it really helped with my eating disorder at the time to see people even larger than me really happy and really comfortable in their bodies. And I wanted to produce the same thing for men and non-binary people when I started this. And definitely it's become now for trans and femme people a lot. Like a lot of my focus is shifting there because it's even harder for trans femmes and feminine men and feminine trans people to be, fully represented. In fact, one of the most, like, I guess, scandalous to some people photo shoots is a trans woman who has an erect organ. And she refers to her organ as a cock. So I'm going to do the same. We had done a whole photo shoot together that I had purposely made sort of PG, even though she's a dancer and a performer and she's very comfortable in the front of the camera. And she's like, I really want to get hard. And so I left the room, gave her privacy. She got erect and I took a couple shots. And it was a really amazing experience for it to be about her empowerment and how she wanted her body to be seen. And there was a thing about, there was this feeling of like, there are so many ways in which trans women are objectified without their consent. And for her to take full agency of her sexuality and be in her body and in her element. And we were in a friend's home and in a living room where she was comfortable. That felt so different than creating porn. And I don't know if people can understand the difference entirely without being in the lived experience of a trans person that's fetishized even when we're walking down the street. And so for us to be fully in our element, well, nude and even to some degree sexual, but for us to have the agency, it's very similar, I think, to the feminism and the need for women to be able to have control of their sexuality. Like we need for cis women and trans women both, there's a need for that agency. And I feel it as a transmasculine person, as a trans man. I feel this need. I have complete strangers assuming things about my body and my genitals and about my size and about how I feel about my size. And there's no way to get to that without nudity. Like, I'm not saying every shoot is sexual. In fact, I would say the opposite. Most of my work is intentionally not sexual. Most of my work is about people being comfortable in their body organically. And but the importance of this moment, it was one of the first times I allowed sexuality in the work, and it was because it was for her. It was for no one else in the world. It was not for me. It was not for the viewer. It was for her. This is what she wanted for her body. And similarly with the rope shoot, is that going to be in the exhibit? I forget.
That's in the exhibit.
Similarly with the rope scene, that was the choice of the models. That was actually after the shoot with the trans femme. That those two people had chosen, they wanted to have an intimate scene where they were doing rope bondage together. There was no other sexuality. It was not porn for us. It was a chance for them to show their relationship through their intricate rope work. And I wouldn't have taken it without it being their idea and their approaching me. I don't ask people to be sexual. And in fact, it was really intentional in the beginning of my work that none of my work was sexual because I wanted survivors to be able to come to me. I wanted people that had been objectified that wanted a safe space to not be objectified, but to be in their body. And it's really hard for people to understand that, I think. I think a lot of viewers that are not queer or that are not trans don't necessarily understand that we walk around our whole lives with our sex lives being the focus. And what is it like to be nude in our bodies without it having to be the focus if we don't want it to be the focus was a part of my work for sure. And it still is. Like, it's about our relationship to our body and whatever that means to us. If the model brings sexuality to it, I'm open to that. But it's more important that it be about empowering us. Does that make sense?
So I appreciate you sharing that. And I think that's a really good point to bring up about that dynamic and how people respond to nudity. Oftentimes, folks focus straight on to sexuality. You know, it reminds me of when I started this project on this idea, or there was so much focus on the body when we talk about identity of trans people. I was curious, what are your thoughts about identity in relation to one's body?
I think that the two places that comes up most in the work is in how I recruit models in order to make sure that I'm trying to address people really being able to find themselves and who they are. Like, I will be like, what is the gap that's missing now? Who is not represented as much, right? For example, like I have had times where I've noticed that it's not as obvious that my artists, my models are physically disabled. So that then I'll be like, okay, how do I do that? Do I purposely put their mobility device in the photo? Do I think about what bodies can be seen? An example that I can think of right now is I don't have any amputees in my work. And like in my theater work, there was always amputees involved. So that might be something I have to think about. Like, how have I not been able to find the right people to represent them? And how would I do that in a way that's respectful rather than fetishizing, right? And that's a particular community that gets fetishized all the time. So probably part of why I don't have anybody that's visibly an amputee in my work is because they're less likely to say yes to photography because they've been objectified, right? And I think about that too when it comes to trans women. I approach them really differently than almost any other subset of my models, is that I don't want them to think it's another porn shoot or another person that's sexualizing them. It's their decision how they want their bodies to be seen. For example, we have Hazel on her rooftop laughing. Like, that was not a sexual shoot at all. I mean, she's a very sexy person and she's a performer. She's in drag shows. But she's not there to be just ogled. She's there to be a large, beautiful woman, period. And most of my work, I wanted it to be approachable in that way. I wanted people to feel like they were there to be comfortable in their body, whatever that meant. And some trans men will ask me, or trans masculine people, depending, will say, I'm an older person, so we used trans men as umbrella terms back in the day. I'm 47, and a lot of younger people don't use those terms, and they say trans masculine and trans feminine. But a few trans men were like, I'm not comfortable being any more nude than my binder. And I'll say, like, that is relevant. Like, your nudity is your nudity. Your binder is fine. Like, you don't have to get more nude than that. So I don't know if there's anybody, I don't think there's anybody in the shoot that has a binder, but some of my models have only done that. And so it's really up to them to decide what nudity means to them and what their relationship is. So, and then another place that identity comes in, it's how I pick photos for, say, this exhibit. It's incredibly hard. I'm like, how do I pick 10 people to represent all of the diversity that's in my shoot? That's more than 10 categories, right? And I'm trying to gender balance. I'm trying to think about size. I'm trying to think about disability. I'm trying to think about race. It's kind of mind bending. And then there is moments of like internalized transphobia that come up of like, how do I decide gender, right? Like, is it by how we're assigned? Does that prove diversity? Is it by how we express ourselves, whether we've had surgery or not? Does that represent us best? And I think you and I even had some of those conversations in the beginning when we were trying to think of maybe one photo to make the biggest, and I couldn't do it. I
Right.
couldn't pick one and have it think that it actually represents like an epiphany about trans people, because it's, I think, as we said then, it's both radical to have surgery and it's radical not to have surgery. It's radical to have body autonomy and be able to be in our bodies, choosing how not only other people see us, but how we see ourselves and how we present ourselves. That's true, to me, that's true radical body autonomy, not whether getting to do what we want to do with our body. That is autonomy, not fitting some image of what the epiphany of what a trans person is, right? And there is no one way to be a trans person. So it's also hard to like pick like 3 pictures of trans masculine people and 3 pictures of trans feminine people and somehow have all of them represent all of us. It's hard. It's incredibly hard. And then you add size and race and ableism and self-identity around disability to the mix. It becomes really hard. And I just have to do the best I can with what I have. And I think as queer people, the assumption is we're always sexual. And I wanted both. I wanted to be able to say, sometimes sex matters. Sometimes it does. Who we have a relationship with, who do we love, who we decide to share our bodies with. Sometimes that is important. And sometimes being in our body and being non-sexualized is also very important. And being able to be happy nude, I think that we've done a horrible, it's really through colonialism and through Puritans saying nudity is wrong, through the lens of people that are often not us anymore, right? Like very few of us are Puritans, right? And we're still trying to shed what colonialism, white supremacy, and sexism did to Turtle Islands. You know, we're still trying to get back to a sense of like, we have a right to be nude in nature and that not be sexualized, or nude in our homes and not be sexualized. We have a right to be comfortable in our bodies.
I mean, preaching to the choir here for me personally. One thing to have it painted and illustrated, but it kind of hits different when it's a photograph. So I think that can impact a community in one way, but I think that does focus on like what is the purpose of even the medium used sometimes, right?
Yeah.
But I think in your context, I think that makes a lot of sense. This because how powerful you need to be comfortable being vulnerable, to be seen in that way, to be seen at all without
And
without
when I
any.
was, sorry,
No, no, go for it.
when I was starting to try and draw and paint nude in order to kind of resolve this for myself, it didn't work for me. I really needed, I needed to see photography of nude trans bodies. I needed to see non-op trans men and non-binary trans masculine people. And so like I put myself in some other photographers' work as I was doing this too. So I've been a model as well. And I have not had any surgeries and I have a very large chest. And there was even moments where like I was in a cis gay shoot and the photographer turns to the director of the project and says, "Oh, do we cut out his like he used the word breast, which I don't usually use, so it was also sort of a misgendering, but he was so uncomfortable still, even in this context of a nude shoot for gay men. He was still uncomfortable with my chest and he was worried about us having problems with it. And I was like, no, if I'm going to be included in the shoot, I'm going to be included with any other man. And he wanted to put a like disclaimer on my photo. And I said, if you're going to put a disclaimer on my photo, you better put it on everybody else's. You better have a reason that we all have to explain why we're nude. And so for me, it was from the very beginning about wanting to see myself and see other people like me respected and shown the same way other people are. I think often why my work gets criticized or censored is partially about fat phobia and homophobia to some degree. And I'm not saying that's always the case, but I think that there's often this fear of our bodies that is different than fears of cis straight white women's bodies. And I think that's really important to examine. We can see the curves of a white woman abstracted in a photograph, and it's not a big deal. But then you have a supersized woman, or you have a fat gay man, or you have a trans person, and it's automatically sexualized no matter what. And I'm not saying that cis white, thin women aren't being sexualized, right? They are. But is a way that we can look at a photograph of a Renaissance woman, not, a Renaissance type woman, and not be as scandalized as then you put two, like I have one photo that's two men that have no sexual relationship sitting on a log together 2 feet apart. And it's sexualized in people's minds, even though neither man is erect, neither man is even looking at the other one. They're just laughing together on a log, and that was seen as sexual. And there was no intent on my part or the models to sexualize them.
I think this is a great way to say to ask one of the last few questions about, you know, of the pieces on display, which one matters to you most? I know that's a very difficult question.
I don't think there is just one. There's different ones for different reasons. There's the picture of Damon, who's a trans man with all of the other men around him, feeling like his teenage self would have never believed that a bunch of handsome hirsute men would have included him and thought that he was one of them. The there's a picture that's not in the exhibit, partially because I didn't feel like it represents diversity very much. It's not that unusual of a picture. It's a white cis woman on a couch, but she took it to therapy and cried over her sense that she wasn't beautiful before the photo shoot and her sense of healing around the photo shoot. Like my models will write me years later and tell me what they're getting out of it, and that is probably the thing that pulls at my heartstrings the most. Is that people will write in and tell me that they're still on a path that my photography started them on. I have a friend named Jerry that's in the belly grab, the one that doesn't have any face. Jerry will write me and be like, "This is the next phase of my growth around my work that started with your photography." So years later, he's still writing me to tell me how much the photo shoot helped him, and that is why I started this work. There are people feeling that they're more in touch with their body because they were my models or because they saw my work. That is it. That is I couldn't even have imagined how common and often I'm able to do that. And that is my favorite part of the work. It's not the end result. It's not the photographs itself. It's the process and what people get out of it.
how do you get your models? It sounds like some people come to you, you
Yes.
come to some other folks, and at this
Yeah.
point, it seems to be feeding itself. But
Yeah.
um,
I,
just
I
to
have
clarify, truthfully, what do you do?
I have a list of people that I still haven't gotten done with after a few years. So like at this point I have to work through my list of people that I've already asked before I can even think of advertising again. But how I started in the beginning, it was hilarious. It was literally going on gay male hookup apps and being like, hey, I'm doing this thing. You want to be in it? And like approaching trans, it was starting by approaching trans and cis men on these apps. That's literally how I started. And it was funny because like I'm not going on to hit on them. And so like these conversations usually don't start that way. They usually start, you know, hello or woof, which is a gay way of saying you're cute. Um, so I literally have done that. I've put on ads on Facebook. I've asked friends of friends. I've run into somebody at a bar. I and that comes from being in theater, right? When you're in the theater, you have a casting you need to do. You have to put it out a lot of different places, a lot of different ways, and you have to be willing to ask the people that might suit the role. And for me, there isn't a particular role I'm looking for. I'm looking to be as broad as possible, right? So when I went through a period of time that there wasn't as many trans femmes, then I recruit specifically at places where trans feminine people are getting to know me or meeting me. Usually that's in person more, actually. I find with trans feminine people, it's harder to do it through an ad, which makes sense. They need to know who the fuck I am and why I'm approaching them. So it's often been through another event that I'm working. There's a local event that a friend of mine puts on that's called QT Noir, and I'm one of the only, it's a Black focused theater and visual arts project, and I'm one of the only white volunteers involved. And so I got to know some women there that were becoming my friends, and then I asked them that way. And so it really kind of depends on how close I am to a community on my own. I mean, it's not that I don't have trans femmes in my life, I do, but not all of them wanted to be in my photo shoots, right? So like, not everybody wants to be a model in the world. Surprise, surprise, right? So like, it
Right.
it is about at times for specific groups, it is about knowing me to some degree, and other groups, no, they don't even need that. They just need the opportunity to be told that they're attractive enough. And most people find it a real compliment if I do it right. I have insulted a couple people. I have approached people at a bar at a time that was not appropriate and had to learn some lessons. Like there was a man, he's still a friendly acquaintance of mine. We get along fine. Like we're not close friends, but I asked him and he was like, so you just want me for my big brown body? And I had to really think about what I had done wrong that day. I hadn't built a relationship. He knows nothing about me. I hadn't put out a general ask that he's choosing to respond to. I'd gone up to somebody specifically and said, you're really, really attractive for this project. I want you. And it felt objectifying to him. And so there is ways that I can fuck it up. And I have. And again, it's about being prepared that you're going to fuck up and then being prepared to apologize. And I apologized to him, and I mean, I'm not going to say that maybe we would have been better friends if I had never done this thing. I don't know, but we are still very amenable with each other. We joke and hang out together in groups and things. So like I think that my ability to apologize at least did some reparations, but did I do permanent damage to a potential friendship? Maybe. Um, and the best I can do is just do better, right? Like
Yeah.
I have never approached somebody in that exact same way again. Like I learned
Right.
something.
Right. You learn and you adapt and you move on.
Yeah.
I have my own set of lessons in that regard. I appreciate you for your time.
Thank you very
And
much.
for anyone who watches this, I mean, please enjoy the photos. Uh, in the rest of the exhibit, the only thing I would like to add is that people are who they say they are. Um, and not everything is tied to what you can see, smell, or feel. I don't know if you want to add any final thoughts to that, Curtis.
Gosh. I think the humanity is what's important, right? I did this work because I was isolated and suffering, and I wanted other people that were isolated and suffering to be able to see themselves as being able to thrive, not just survive, right? Somebody, I didn't realize how important this feedback was, but I made a calendar for the first time. I'm not sure if I'll ever do them again because there's so much work, but I made a calendar for the first time, and somebody said, I've never seen so many happy trans people, especially Black and brown trans people, in one place and at a time. And I thought, oh gosh, I haven't done a good enough job of showing diversity of emotion. And then a couple of my friends sat with me with that thought, and they were like, are you kidding me? How many trans people do we need to see that are joyful right now? Right? Like that could be a revolutionary thing to do right now, is to show us joyfully. And so for me, I had to sit with that and be like, okay, like the fact that we find joy in almost every one of these shoots, like there's a moment of joy. There is some photos of mine that are not all happiness. I'm not convinced that that's the only thing we need to show. But in a period of time where racism is getting worse, transphobia is getting worse, xenophobia is getting worse, what could be better than some of us getting to see that we can have joy?
Really appreciate that. Thank you so very much.